It's so lovely to have you here with us tonight. There's something quite special about the way these mysteries bring together listeners from all corners of the world. If you want, share in the comments where you're joining us from. And don't forget to subscribe for a brand new mystery every day. Now, wrap yourself in a blanket or pour a cup of tea and let's uncover the puzzle together. Chapter 1. The Charity Auction at Gossington Hall. The October evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular golden quality that made even the most ordinary moments seem touched by magic. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her pale blue cardigan and stepped carefully along the gravel drive leading to Gossington Hall, her sensible shoes making soft crunching sounds against the autumn leaves that had begun their gentle surrender to the season. She paused for a moment at the foot of the stone steps, observing the warm glow spilling from the tall windows of Colonel Bantry's drawing room. The charity auction for the village hospital fund had drawn quite a crowd this evening, and Miss Marple could already hear the pleasant murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter that spoke of a successful gathering. How lovely it was, she reflected, when the community came together for such worthy causes. "Miss Marple, how wonderful to see you," called Mrs. Dolly Bantry from the doorway, her plump figure silhouetted against the light. She wore a burgundy velvet dress that suited her colouring admirably, though Miss Marple noted with her characteristic attention to detail that the woman seemed rather more animated than usual this evening. There was something almost brittle about her cheerfulness, like fine china that might crack under too much pressure. "My dear Dolly, what a splendid turnout," Miss Marple replied warmly, accepting the offered arm as they made their way into the hall. "I do hope the auction will be a tremendous success." The drawing room buzzed with the comfortable energy of neighbours gathering for a good cause. Miss Marple's keen eyes swept the room, taking in the familiar faces and noting, as she always did, the small details that others might overlook. Dr. Haydock stood near the fireplace, deep in conversation with a young man she didn't immediately recognise, tall, with sandy hair and an earnest expression that suggested he took life rather seriously. The doctor's new assistant, perhaps. At the far end of the room, Colonel Bantry was arranging items on a long table that served as the auction display. Theatrical costumes hung from a portable rack, their rich fabrics catching the lamplight beautifully, but it was the woman standing beside them who drew most of the attention in the room. Vivienne Ashford was exactly what one would expect a London actress to be. Striking rather than conventionally beautiful, with dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon and wearing a sophisticated black dress that managed to be both simple and dramatic. She moved with the particular grace of someone accustomed to being watched, gesturing expressively as she explained the provenance of various costume pieces to an attentive cluster of villagers. "She's quite something, isn't she?" whispered Mrs. Bantry, following Miss Marple's gaze. "So generous to donate all those lovely things. Some of them are from actual West End productions, you know." Miss Marple murmured her appreciation, though something in Mrs. Bantry's tone caught her attention. There was an undercurrent there, a slight tension that didn't quite match the enthusiasm of her words. How curious that even in moments of apparent celebration, human nature revealed its complexities. "Miss Ashford," Colonel Bantry called out, tapping his teaspoon against his glass to gather attention. "Perhaps you'd be so kind as to tell everyone about this magnificent evening gown." Vivienne smiled and lifted a shimmering silver dress from the rack. "This little number," she said, her trained voice carrying easily across the room, was worn in the second act of Moonlight and Roses at the Criterion Theatre. The beadwork alone took 3 seamstresses 6 weeks to complete. As she spoke, Miss Marple noticed the young man by the fireplace, Dr. Haydock's assistant, watching Vivienne with an intensity that seemed to go beyond mere admiration for theatrical costume. His hands were clenched at his sides, and there was something in his expression that suggested strong emotion carefully held in check. How interesting that a medical man should react so strongly to an actress he presumably didn't know well. "Timothy," Dr. Haydock said quietly to his companion, "perhaps you could help me fetch those extra chairs from the morning room." The young man, Timothy, apparently, started slightly, as if pulled from deep thought. "Of course, doctor," he replied, but Miss Marple noticed he cast one more glance toward Vivienne before following Dr. Haydock from the room. Near the window, a younger woman sat somewhat apart from the main group, her attention ostensibly focused on a book but her eyes frequently drifting to the actress. Miss Marple didn't recognise her, though there was something familiar about her delicate features, and the particular shade of auburn in her hair. "That's my niece, Sarah Clement," Mrs. Bantry explained, noticing Miss Marple's curious glance. She's staying with us for a few weeks. Poor dear lost her fiancé in the war, you know. I do hope this little outing will do her some good." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she found herself wondering why someone seeking distraction from grief would choose to sit apart from the cheerful activity of the auction. Sarah Clement's pale hands gripped her book rather tightly, and there was a tension in her posture that spoke of more than simple social shyness. As the evening progressed and the auction began in earnest, Miss Marple settled into a comfortable chair near the back of the room. Content to observe the pleasant theatre of village life unfolding before her, Colonel Bantry proved to be an amusing auctioneer, and various lots found enthusiastic bidders among the gathered neighbours. It was when they reached the theatrical accessories, silk scarves, paste jewellery, and elegant gloves, that Miss Marple noticed the first truly discordant note of the evening. Vivienne Ashford had been examining the items with professional interest, but suddenly she went very still, staring down at something in her hands with an expression of what could only be described as shock. In the warm lamplight of Gossington Hall, surrounded by the comfortable sounds of friends and neighbours, Miss Marple felt the familiar prickle of unease that had served her so well over the years. Something, she realised with quiet certainty, was about to go very wrong indeed. Chapter 2. The Gloves That Shouldn't Have Been There. The silence that followed Vivienne Ashford's collapse was one of those profound, crystalline moments that seems to stretch time itself. Miss Marple, who had witnessed enough of life's sudden turns to recognise them instantly, was already moving forward when the actress's knees buckled and she crumpled gracefully to the Persian carpet, her dark hair spilling from its elegant arrangement. "Someone fetch Dr. Haydock at once," Colonel Bantry commanded, his military training serving him well in the crisis. But Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Haydock was already pushing through the small crowd that had instinctively formed around the fallen woman, his young assistant Timothy close behind, both men's faces wearing the particular expression of medical professionals confronting an emergency. As Dr. Haydock knelt beside Vivienne, Miss Marple found herself studying not the victim but the reactions of those around her. Mrs. Bantry had gone quite pale and was gripping the back of a chair with white knuckles. Sarah Clement had risen from her seat by the window, her book forgotten on the floor, and was staring at the scene with what appeared to be fascination rather than shock. Most curious of all was Timothy Morse, whose face had taken on an almost greenish tinge as he watched his superior examine the unconscious actress. "I'm afraid," Dr. Haydock began, then paused, his fingers moving from Vivienne's wrist to her neck in the familiar ritual of checking for vital signs. The pause stretched uncomfortably long before he looked up at the expectant faces surrounding him. "I'm very sorry to say that Miss Ashford has passed away." The news struck the gathering like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of gasps and exclamations. Miss Marple, however, found her attention drawn not to the general reaction, but to something quite specific that had caught her eye. In Vivienne's left hand, clutched with the peculiar tenacity of the dying, was a pair of exquisite lace gloves. They were beautiful things, clearly handmade with the kind of delicate craftsmanship that spoke of hours of patient work. The lace was worked in an intricate pattern that seemed almost like tiny flowers, though Miss Marple's sharp eyes detected something unusual about the design. More puzzling still, these gloves had most certainly not been among the auction items she had observed earlier in the evening. "Doctor," Miss Marple said quietly, moving closer to where Dr. Haydock was conducting his examination, "might I ask about those gloves?" Dr. Haydock glanced up, his weathered face showing the strain of the moment. "Gloves? Oh yes. She was holding them when she fell. Odd thing that. Heart failure, I suspect. She had a condition, you know. The excitement of the evening, perhaps." But Miss Marple was studying the gloves more carefully now, and what she saw made her frown slightly. Worked into the delicate lacework almost hidden in the pattern were a set of initials. M.R. The letters were formed by the lace itself, created by someone with remarkable skill and patience. Even more intriguing, as she leaned closer, though she was careful not to disturb the doctor's work, she detected the faintest trace of an unusual scent. It was sweet, almost pleasant, with an underlying note that reminded her of something, yes, rather like the bitter almond essence her cook had once used too liberally in a batch of macaroons. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. She had encountered that particular scent before, though not in any kitchen. "I say," Colonel Bantry said, having recovered his composure somewhat, "does anyone know where those gloves came from? They weren't part of the auction lots, were they?" A murmur of confusion ran through the assembled guests. Mrs. Bantry shook her head firmly. Certainly not from my collection. I'd remember something so fine. Perhaps Miss Ashford brought them herself, suggested one of the villagers. Actresses do have such lovely accessories. But Miss Marple noticed that Timothy Morse had gone even paler at the sight of the gloves, if such a thing were possible. His hands were trembling slightly, and he seemed to be making a considerable effort to avoid looking directly at them. When Dr. Haydock asked him to help move the body to a more private location, Timothy's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Of course, Doctor. Should we remove the gloves?" "Best to leave everything as it is for now," Dr. Haydock replied. "The police will want to see things exactly as they were." At the mention of police, another ripple of unease went through the gathering. Sarah Clement, Miss Marple noticed, had moved closer to the group around Vivienne's body, and was staring at the gloves with an expression that was difficult to read. There was recognition there, certainly, but also something that looked remarkably like fear. "Miss Clement," Miss Marple said gently, "you seem to know something about these gloves." Sarah started as if she'd been caught doing something improper. "Oh, no, not really. That is, they're very beautiful, aren't they? The workmanship is extraordinary. Someone with remarkable skill must have made them." Her answer was perfectly reasonable, yet Miss Marple detected something evasive in the young woman's manner. There was also something about the way she pronounced the initials M.R. when she repeated them aloud. A slight catch in her voice that suggested they held more significance than she was willing to admit. As the evening dissolved into the sort of subdued chaos that follows unexpected death, Miss Marple found herself thinking about patterns, not just the intricate lacework of the mysterious gloves, though that was certainly fascinating, but the patterns of human behaviour she had observed. Timothy Morse's obvious distress seemed to go beyond the natural reaction to sudden death. Sarah Clement's recognition of the gloves, despite her denial, was clearly more than casual, and Mrs. Bantry's nervousness had begun well before Vivienne's collapse. When Inspector Slack arrived, summoned by Colonel Bantry's telephone call, Miss Marple made it her business to have a quiet word with him about her observations. The inspector, who had learned over the years to respect the elderly lady's insights, listened with more attention than his gruff manner might suggest. "Bitter almonds, you say?" he muttered, making notes in his worn notebook. "And these initials in the lace?" "M.R., Miss Marple confirmed, "most skillfully worked into the pattern. And, Inspector, I do think it would be worth asking whether anyone here has encountered such gloves before. The reactions I observed suggest that someone, at least, found them familiar." As the last of the guests were finally allowed to depart, Miss Marple lingered for a moment in the now quiet drawing-room. The auction table still displayed its colourful array of theatrical costumes, but they seemed somehow diminished now, like actors after the curtain has fallen. Only the mystery of the lace gloves remained, beautiful and enigmatic, holding their secrets close. In the growing darkness outside Gossington Hall, Miss Marple reflected that in her experience the most innocent-looking objects often harboured the deepest mysteries, and these gloves, with their delicate beauty and hidden initials, promised to reveal a story that was anything but simple. Chapter 3. Death Comes to the Auction House. The morning after the charity auction dawned grey and drizzly, the sort of weather that seemed to mirror the subdued mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead, like a comfortable but melancholy shawl. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night thinking about lace patterns and bitter almonds, made her way to the village post office with the deliberate purpose of someone who understood that in small communities information flowed as reliably as the morning mail. Mrs. Jameson, the postmistress, was in full conversational flight when Miss Marple arrived, holding forth to a small gathering of early customers about the previous evening's tragic events. The woman's voice carried that particular tone of excitement that accompanies genuinely shocking news, though Miss Marple noted she was careful to temper it with appropriate expressions of sympathy. "Such a shock," Mrs. Jameson was saying as she sorted letters with practised efficiency, "and her so young and talented, though I did hear she had a weak heart. These theatrical people, you know, all that excitement and late nights, it does take a toll." Miss Marple accepted her pension cheque and listened with the patient attention of someone who knew that village gossip, properly filtered, often contained grains of valuable truth. But it was young Mrs. Fletcher's comment that caught her particular interest. "My Tom was delivering groceries to Gossington Hall this morning," Mrs. Fletcher said, lowering her voice conspirationally. "He said there were police cars there again, not just Inspector Slack, but someone from the county headquarters. Seems odd for a natural death, doesn't it? Indeed, it did seem odd, Miss Marple reflected as she made her way back along the high street. The presence of county officials suggested that someone, quite possibly Inspector Slack himself, had found reason to question the initial assessment of Vivienne Ashford's demise. This was encouraging, as Miss Marple had spent considerable time during her sleepless night thinking about those mysterious lace gloves and their faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds. Her musings were interrupted by the sight of Dr. Haydock's motor car pulled up outside the Bantry house. The doctor himself was just emerging from the front door, his medical bag in hand and his expression unusually grave. Miss Marple, who had known Dr. Haydock for many years, recognised the particular set of his shoulders that indicated professional concern. "Good morning, Doctor," she called out as he approached his vehicle. "I do hope Mrs. Bantry isn't unwell. Yesterday evening was such a shock for everyone." Dr. Haydock paused, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Miss Marple, no, Dolly is well enough considering, just a mild sedative to help her sleep. It's been a difficult time for everyone who was present last night." There was something in his manner that suggested he wanted to say more but was bound by professional discretion. Miss Marple, who understood the delicate balance between curiosity and propriety, chose her next words carefully. "I've been thinking about those beautiful gloves Miss Ashford was holding," she said. "Such exquisite workmanship. The initials worked into the lace were particularly skillful. M.R., wasn't it? I don't suppose anyone has determined where they came from." Dr. Haydock's expression grew even more thoughtful. "Ah, yes, the gloves. Inspector Slack mentioned you'd noticed something about them. Between you and me, Miss Marple, I've had to revise my initial assessment of Miss Ashford's death." This was exactly what Miss Marple had hoped to hear, though she kept her expression appropriately grave. "Oh dear, not natural causes then?" "I'm afraid not. The post-mortem examination revealed traces of a rather sophisticated poison, one that mimics the symptoms of heart failure quite effectively. The county laboratory identified it as a derivative of a particular plant toxin, not something one would encounter accidentally." Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intellectual engagement that accompanied the confirmation of her suspicions. "And the gloves? Most peculiar thing. When we examined them more closely, we found tiny perforations in the fingertips barely visible to the naked eye, but clearly deliberate. The poison appears to have been concentrated there, absorbed through the skin when she handled them." Dr. Haydock shook his head grimly. "Quite a clever method, really, almost impossible to detect without knowing what to look for." The implications of this revelation settled over Miss Marple like pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to form a recognisable picture. Someone had deliberately prepared those gloves as an instrument of murder, knowing that Vivienne would handle them. But how could the killer have been certain she would pick them up? And why had no one claimed knowledge of bringing them to the auction? "Doctor," Miss Marple said carefully, "your assistant, Mr. Morse. He seemed quite distressed last evening, even before Miss Ashford's collapse. I hope he's bearing up well under the circumstances." A shadow crossed Dr. Haydock's features. "Timothy is, well, he's naturally sensitive to such things. He's only recently qualified, you know. These situations are always difficult for young doctors." He paused, then added, with evident reluctance, "I'm afraid Inspector Slack has asked to speak with him this afternoon. Routine inquiries, of course." But Miss Marple detected something in the doctor's tone that suggested the inquiries might be rather more than routine. As Dr. Haydock drove away, she found herself thinking about Timothy Morse's reaction to the gloves, the way his face had drained of colour, his obvious reluctance to touch them. Such reactions could indicate guilt, certainly, but they might equally suggest recognition or fear. Her contemplation was interrupted by the approach of Sarah Clement, who was walking along the street with a sort of determined stride that suggested someone trying to appear purposeful while actually being quite aimless. The young woman's face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a night as sleepless as Miss Marple's own. "Miss Marple," Sarah said, slowing as she drew near, "I hope you're well this morning. Such a terrible business yesterday evening." "Indeed it was, my dear. Are you quite all right? You look rather tired." Sarah's hand went unconsciously to her throat, a gesture Miss Marple had observed often in people struggling with difficult emotions. "I suppose I am rather. I keep thinking about those gloves Miss Ashford was holding. They were so beautiful, but somehow familiar." This was precisely what Miss Marple had hoped to explore further. Familiar? In what way? "The pattern," Sarah said slowly, as if the words were being drawn from her reluctantly. That particular style of lacework, it's quite distinctive, isn't it? Not the sort of thing one sees very often these days. The initials too, MR, they seem to mean something, though I can't quite place what. Miss Marple studied the young woman's face carefully. There was definitely recognition there, but it was mixed with something that looked very much like fear. Perhaps, she suggested gently, it would be helpful to share these thoughts with Inspector Slack. I'm sure he would be most interested in any information about the gloves. Sarah's reaction was immediate and telling. She went even paler, if such a thing were possible, and took a small step backward. Oh, I don't think I could be of any real help. It's just a feeling, you know, nothing concrete. But as she hurried away down the street, Miss Marple reflected that feelings, particularly the sort that made young women look frightened and sleepless, were often based on very concrete realities indeed. The mystery of the lace gloves was deepening, and with it the certainty that Vivienne Ashford's death had roots that extended far beyond a simple charity auction in a quiet English village. Standing in the gentle morning drizzle, Miss Marple considered the threads of the case beginning to weave themselves into a pattern as intricate as the lacework itself. Someone had known exactly how to ensure that Vivienne would handle those poisoned gloves, and someone in St. Mary Mead was keeping secrets that were literally a matter of life and death. Chapter 4. Secrets from the London Stage. The afternoon brought with it a most unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. She was tending to her roses despite the persistent drizzle when she heard the crunch of gravel that announced someone approaching along her garden path. Looking up from her pruning, she was surprised to see Inspector Slack himself, his usually brusque demeanour tempered by what appeared to be genuine uncertainty. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, setting down her secateurs and brushing the rain from her cardigan. "How lovely to see you. Do come in out of this dreadful weather." Once settled in her sitting room with a proper cup of tea, for Miss Marple firmly believed that all serious conversations required the civilizing influence of properly brewed tea. Inspector Slack came directly to the point in his characteristic manner. "Miss Marple, I'll be frank with you. This business with the actress has taken some rather unexpected turns, and I find myself in need of your particular perspective on human nature." Miss Marple poured the tea with steady hands, though her mind was already racing ahead to what revelations might have prompted this unprecedented admission from the usually self-sufficient inspector. "Of course, Inspector. I'm always happy to help if I can." "It's about Miss Ashford's background," Slack continued, accepting his cup with the careful handling of a man more accustomed to police station mugs than delicate china. "We've been making inquiries in London, and it seems our victim was involved in some rather unpleasant business about 20 years ago." Miss Marple settled herself comfortably in her chair, the better to give this information her full attention. 20 years would place the events in question during the war years, a time when many secrets were born and buried, often to resurface years later with devastating consequences. "There was another actress," Inspector Slack went on, consulting his notebook with the deliberate care of a man unused to dealing with theatrical intrigues. "Margaret Rivers was her name, quite well known in her day, apparently. She died in what was officially ruled an accident, fell down a flight of stairs at her lodgings in Bloomsbury in 1943. The name struck Miss Marple immediately, though she was careful not to let her recognition show too plainly. "MR," she murmured, almost to herself. "The initials on the gloves." "Precisely what I was thinking," Slack nodded approvingly. "But here's where it gets interesting. According to our contacts at Scotland Yard, there were rumours at the time that Miss Rivers' death wasn't entirely accidental. She'd been having a very public dispute with Vivienne Ashford over a role in a West End production." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "A professional rivalry?" "More than that, it seems. According to the theatrical gossip of the time, Margaret Rivers accused Vivienne of sabotaging her career, spreading malicious rumours, interfering with casting decisions, that sort of thing. Margaret was known for her beautiful handmade lace accessories, apparently, made them herself as a hobby." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in Miss Marple's mind with the satisfying click of a well-made mechanism falling into place. "And I suppose Miss Rivers had family who might have harboured resentment over her death." Inspector Slack's expression grew grimmer. "Indeed she did. A nephew, for one, a young man named Timothy Rivers Morse, changed his surname after the war, but the connection's clear enough." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. Timothy Morse's extreme reaction to the lace gloves suddenly made perfect sense, as did his obvious distress throughout the evening. Dr. Haydock's assistant, she said quietly. The very same. And there's more. Margaret Rivers had a brother, Robert, who was engaged to a young woman before he was killed in action in 1944. The fiancée was one Sarah Rivers, though she took her stepfather's name of Clement after the war. The web of connections was growing more complex by the moment, and Miss Marple found herself revising her earlier assessments of the evening's participants. So both Timothy Morse and Sarah Clement had personal connections to Margaret Rivers? Both had reasons to resent Vivienne Ashford, certainly. According to the old police files, neither of them ever quite believed Margaret's death was accidental. Inspector Slack leaned forward slightly. But here's what's really got me puzzled, Miss Marple. If one of them wanted revenge for something that happened 20 years ago, why wait until now, and why use such an elaborate method? It was an excellent question, and Miss Marple found herself contemplating the various possibilities while she refilled their teacups. In her experience, long-delayed revenge usually required a specific trigger, some event that brought old wounds back to the surface with renewed pain. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "had Miss Ashford been in contact with either of them recently? Or perhaps planning to reveal something about Margaret Rivers' death? That's just what we're trying to determine. We found some rather interesting correspondence in Miss Ashford's London flat. Letters from someone calling themselves a friend of truth, demanding that she make amends for past wrongs and threatening to expose what really happened to poor Margaret if she didn't." Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. Anonymous letters? How unpleasant. And did Miss Ashford respond to these threats? Apparently not directly, but according to her housekeeper, she'd been increasingly nervous over the past few months, kept saying someone was dredging up old ghosts and that she might have to set the record straight about something. The implications were troubling. If Vivienne had been planning to reveal new information about Margaret Rivers' death, it would certainly provide a motive for murder, but it also suggested that the killer might have been acting out of desperation rather than simple revenge. "There's something else," Inspector Slack continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "We've discovered that Margaret Rivers wasn't just an actress. According to some rather classified files that took considerable effort to access, she was also working for British intelligence during the war, used her theatrical connections to gather information from German sympathisers in London society." This revelation cast an entirely new light on the situation. Miss Marple found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the case. If Margaret Rivers had been involved in intelligence work, her death might have had implications far beyond theatrical rivalry. "How fascinating," Miss Marple murmured. "And presumably dangerous work." "Extremely. The sort of thing that could have made her enemies who weren't particularly concerned with theatrical niceties." Slack's expression was troubled. "The question is whether Vivienne Ashford knew about Margaret's war work, and if so, whether she was planning to reveal it." As Inspector Slack prepared to leave, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the intricate patterns of human motivation that lay beneath the surface of even the most seemingly straightforward crimes. The lace gloves with their hidden initials were beginning to seem less like a simple instrument of revenge and more like a message, a way of connecting past and present in a pattern as complex as the lacework itself. Standing at her window and watching the inspector's car disappear down the lane, Miss Marple reflected that in her experience, the most dangerous secrets were often those that people believed they had successfully buried. But secrets, like roses, had a way of pushing through the earth when the conditions were right, and sometimes their emergence could be deadly indeed. Chapter 5. Timothy Morse. Under suspicion. The following morning brought news that travelled through St. Mary Mead with the swift efficiency that only truly shocking developments could achieve. Miss Marple learned of it from her daily help, Mrs. Clements, who arrived at the cottage with her eyes bright with the particular excitement that accompanies being the bearer of momentous tidings. "They've arrested young Dr. Morse," Mrs. Clements announced without preamble, setting down her marketing basket with rather more force than was strictly necessary. "Took him from Dr. Haydock's surgery first thing this morning, they did. Poor Dr. Haydock looked quite devastated, according to Mrs. Price, who saw it happen." Miss Marple, who had been expecting some development along these lines since her conversation with Inspector Slack, nevertheless felt a small pang of concern. In her experience, the most obvious suspect was rarely the guilty party, though appearances could be deceptive in even the most straightforward cases. "How distressing for everyone concerned," she murmured, though her mind was already working through the implications. "I suppose the police must have found additional evidence." That's just what I heard from the postmistress. Mrs. Clements continued, warming to her theme as she began her dusting with unusual vigour. Seems they found letters in his lodgings, correspondence with some theatrical historians in London, asking all sorts of questions about his Aunt Margaret's death. Been at it for months apparently, trying to prove it wasn't an accident. This information aligned with what Miss Marple had already surmised, though it raised as many questions as it answered. If Timothy had been conducting his own investigation into his aunt's death, it suggested a methodical mind rather than a simply vengeful one. But it also provided the police with a clear motive and evidence of premeditation. Miss Marple decided that a visit to Dr. Haydock might be in order. The doctor had always been a sensible man, and his assessment of his young assistant's character would be valuable in determining whether Timothy was capable of such an elaborate murder. She found Dr. Haydock in his surgery, sitting behind his desk with the particular stillness of a man who had received a profound shock. His usually ruddy complexion was pale, and there was a heaviness about his shoulders that spoke of genuine distress. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with an effort at his usual courtesy, "I suppose you've heard about Timothy." "I'm afraid so, Doctor. Such a shock for you. You must have worked closely with the young man." Dr. Haydock sank back into his chair with a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his being. 6 months he's been with me. Bright, conscientious, gentle with the patients. I'd have trusted him with my own life. He shook his head slowly. "I still can't believe he's capable of murder." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair opposite his desk, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his pipe. "The police seem quite certain of their case. I understand they found evidence of his investigation into his aunt's death?" "Oh yes. Timothy never made any secret of that. Told me all about it when he first came to work here. Said he'd always believed there was more to Margaret's death than appeared on the surface. But investigating something and committing murder are entirely different matters." Dr. Haydock's voice carried the conviction of a man defending someone he genuinely cared about. "Did he ever speak of Miss Ashford specifically, or mention any plans to confront her?" "That's just the thing that puzzles me most," Dr. Haydock said, striking a match with hands that shook slightly. "When Timothy learned that Vivienne Ashford was coming to the auction, he seemed genuinely excited. Said it would be a perfect opportunity to ask her some questions about the old days, completely above board, you understand. Nothing threatening or secretive about it." This was intriguing. Miss Marple had observed Timothy's behaviour at the auction, and while he had certainly seemed nervous, there had been something about his demeanour that suggested anticipation rather than malicious intent, and yet he appeared quite distressed when he saw those lace gloves. Dr. Haydock drew thoughtfully on his pipe. "Yes, that did seem to shake him badly, but Miss Marple, if you'd seen his face when he realised what those gloves meant, it wasn't guilt I saw there, it was horror, pure, genuine horror, as if he was seeing something he'd never expected or wanted to see." Miss Marple found this observation particularly significant. In her considerable experience with human nature, genuine surprise was difficult to counterfeit convincingly. "Doctor, you mentioned that Timothy had been corresponding with theatrical historians. Do you know what specific information he was seeking?" "He showed me some of the letters, actually. He was trying to trace people who had known Margaret during her last months. Other actors, theatrical agents, anyone who might have witnessed her state of mind before her death. He seemed particularly interested in finding out whether she'd been frightened of someone." The picture that was emerging of Timothy's investigation suggested a young man genuinely seeking truth rather than planning revenge. Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that while Timothy might have had motive and opportunity, the emotional logic of the crime didn't fit his apparent character. "There's something else that troubles me," Dr. Haydock continued. "Timothy has extensive knowledge of poisons, certainly, any medical man would, but the particular toxin used in this case was quite exotic, derived from a plant that's not native to England. Timothy would have had to go to considerable trouble to obtain it, and I can't imagine how he would have managed it without arousing suspicion." This was an excellent point, and Miss Marple filed it away for future consideration. "Have the police explained how they believe he acquired the poison?" "They seem to think he obtained it through medical supply channels, but I've made some inquiries of my own, and no one in the legitimate pharmaceutical trade has any record of supplying such a substance. It's the sort of thing that would require very specialised knowledge and connections." As Miss Marple walked home through the village, she found herself thinking about the discrepancies in the case against Timothy Morse. While the circumstantial evidence was certainly strong, There were elements that didn't quite fit the picture of a calculating murderer. His open investigation into his aunt's death, his apparent anticipation of meeting Vivienne, and his shocked reaction to the gloves all suggested someone who had been as surprised by the events as anyone else. More troubling still was the question of the poison itself. If Dr. Haydock was correct about its exotic nature, it implied a level of planning and specialized knowledge that seemed inconsistent with Timothy's straightforward approach to investigating his aunt's death. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, observing the way the afternoon light filtered through the clouds to illuminate her roses. In gardening, as in detection, she had learned that the most obvious explanation was not always the correct one. Sometimes the most vigorous growth concealed weak roots, while the most modest plants possessed the deepest and strongest foundations. As she made her way up her garden path, Miss Marple reflected that while Timothy Moore certainly had reason to hate Vivienne Ashford, the actual method of the murder suggested a mind more devious and calculating than anything she had observed in the young doctor. The real murderer, she was beginning to suspect, was someone who had been content to let suspicion fall on Timothy while remaining safely hidden in the shadows. The question now was whether she could uncover the truth before an innocent man paid the price for someone else's carefully orchestrated revenge. Chapter 6. The pattern in the lace tells a story. The solution to the mystery of the lace gloves came to Miss Marple in the most unexpected way, as solutions often did through a chance encounter that illuminated connections previously hidden in shadow. She was making her way past the village church when she noticed Mrs. Price, the elderly lacemaker, sitting on a bench in the churchyard with a piece of delicate needlework spread across her lap. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple called out, genuinely pleased to see the old woman, who had become something of a recluse since her husband's death the previous winter. "How lovely to see you taking the air, and what beautiful work you're doing." Mrs. Price looked up with eyes that, despite her advanced years, remained sharp and bright. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to stop. I was just finishing this christening cap for young Mrs. Fletcher's baby, though I must say, it's not half so fine as some of the work I've seen recently." Something in her tone caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. "Oh, you've seen some particularly fine lacework lately?" "Indeed I have. Those gloves that poor Miss Ashford was holding when she died. Now that was craftsmanship of the highest order, Venetian point technique, but worked in an English pattern. Quite remarkable, really. I don't suppose I'll see work like that again in my lifetime." Miss Marple felt the familiar quickening of pulse that accompanied a significant discovery. "You were able to examine the gloves closely?" "Oh yes. Inspector Slack brought them to me yesterday afternoon. Wanted to know if I could tell him anything about who might have made them." Mrs. Price set down her needlework and looked at Miss Marple with an expression of considerable interest. "Most intriguing things they were. The pattern told quite a story, if you knew how to read it." This was exactly what Miss Marple had been hoping to hear. She settled herself on the bench beside Mrs. Price, giving the conversation her complete attention. "A story? How fascinating. What sort of story?" Mrs. Price's weathered fingers moved unconsciously, as if working invisible stitches. "Well, you see, the pattern wasn't just decorative. There were symbols worked into the lace, tiny ones, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Stars and crosses and little geometric shapes all arranged in a very specific sequence." "Symbols? How curious. Do you think they had some particular meaning?" "Oh, I'm quite certain they did. You see, during the war, some of us who worked with lace developed ways of hiding information in our patterns. Messages for the resistance, you might say. Locations, dates, even names could be encoded in the stitchwork if you were clever about it." Miss Marple's heart began to beat a little faster. This was the connection she had been seeking, the link between Margaret River's wartime intelligence work and the mysterious gloves that had killed Vivienne Ashford. "How ingenious," she murmured. "And you think these particular gloves contained such coded information?" Mrs. Price nodded emphatically. "I'm certain of it. The pattern was far too complex and deliberate to be merely decorative. When I showed Inspector Slack how to read the symbols, his face went quite white, especially when we worked out what the coordinates referred to." "Coordinates?" "Hidden right there in the lacework, clear as day once you knew how to look. They point to a specific location in our own churchyard, actually. The grave of old Colonel Weston, you remember him, Miss Marple, died just after the war ended." Miss Marple did indeed remember Colonel Weston, a quiet man who had kept very much to himself, and had been buried with surprisingly elaborate military honours for someone who was supposed to have spent the war in England. How very interesting. Did Inspector Slack investigate the location? He did indeed, this very morning. Found something too, by the looks of things, though he wouldn't tell me what. Spent nearly 2 hours there with his men digging around the base of the headstone. The pieces of the puzzle were rearranging themselves in Miss Marple's mind with startling clarity. If the gloves contained coordinates pointing to Colonel Weston's grave, and if Margaret Rivers had been involved in wartime intelligence, then perhaps the Colonel's death had not been as natural as it had appeared at the time. "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said carefully, "when you examined the gloves, did you notice anything else unusual about them? The initials, for instance?" "Ah, yes, MR worked into the border. But that wasn't the only marking, you know. There was another set of initials, much smaller and cleverly hidden in the pattern. DB they were, though you'd have had to look very carefully to spot them." Miss Marple felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the October afternoon. "DB," she repeated quietly. "Dolly Bantry." "The gloves were definitely made by someone with exceptional skill," Mrs. Price continued, apparently unaware of the bombshell she had just delivered. "Someone who had been trained in the wartime coding techniques and had access to the finest materials. The silk was of a quality you can't get these days, and the workmanship was absolutely flawless." As Miss Marple walked slowly home from the churchyard, her mind was working furiously to process these new revelations. The presence of Mrs. Bantry's initials hidden in the lacework of the murder weapon cast an entirely new light on the evening's events, but it also raised troubling questions about motives and opportunities that she was only beginning to understand. If Mrs. Bantry had made the gloves, she must have known about Margaret Rivers's intelligence work and her connection to whatever secrets were hidden at Colonel Weston's grave. But why would Dolly Bantry want to kill Vivienne Ashford? And how did she know that Vivienne would handle the gloves? The answers, Miss Marple suspected, lay buried with Colonel Weston, quite literally, if Inspector Slack's morning excavation had revealed what she was beginning to suspect it had. The coordinates in the lace had not been chosen randomly. They pointed to the resting place of secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous secrets were often those that seemed to have died with their keepers. But in this case, Margaret Rivers had been clever enough to encode the truth in lacework that would survive long after she was gone, waiting for someone with the skill to read its hidden message. The question now was whether that message had arrived 20 years too late to save Vivienne Ashford, or whether there was still time to prevent further tragedy from unfolding in the quiet shadows of St. Mary Mead. Standing in her garden as the afternoon light began to fade, Miss Marple found herself thinking about patterns, not just the intricate lacework that had revealed so much, but the patterns of human behaviour that repeated themselves across the years, weaving threads of past and present into designs that were often beautiful and sometimes deadly. Chapter 7. The Hiding Place Beneath the Angel's Wing. Miss Marple's evening was disturbed by the unexpected arrival of Inspector Slack, who appeared at her cottage door looking rather more shaken than she had ever seen him. The usually composed policeman was clutching a leather document case with hands that trembled slightly, and his face bore the expression of a man who had uncovered truths he would have preferred to leave buried. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I need to speak with you about what we found at Colonel Weston's grave, and I'm afraid it changes everything about this case." Miss Marple ushered him into her sitting room and busied herself with preparing tea, noting that the inspector seemed to require the few moments of normalcy that the familiar ritual provided. When they were settled with their cups, Slack opened the document case with the careful movements of someone handling something potentially explosive. "The coordinates in those gloves were precise to the inch," he began. "They led us to a hidden compartment built into the base of Colonel Weston's headstone. Quite cleverly done, you'd never notice it unless you knew exactly where to look." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "And what did you find in this compartment?" Inspector Slack withdrew a manila folder from the case, handling it as if it contained fragile glass. "Documents, Miss Marple. Wartime intelligence files that were supposed to have been destroyed decades ago, and they tell a very different story about what happened during the war than what any of us believed." He opened the folder carefully, revealing pages of typed reports and handwritten notes, all bearing the official stamps and watermarks of British intelligence. Miss Marple could see that some of the documents were water-stained and yellowed with age, but the text remained clearly legible. According to these files, Slack continued, Margaret Rivers was indeed working for our intelligence service, just as we suspected. But she wasn't just gathering information from German sympathizers in London society. She was tracking a network of collaborators who were passing vital information to the enemy. Miss Marple studied the inspector's grave expression. And I suppose this network included people here in St. Mary Mead. I'm afraid so. Colonel Weston, for one. The man we all thought was a hero who spent the war doing administrative work in London was actually selling information about Allied troop movements and supply lines to German agents. According to Margaret's reports, he was responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen British servicemen. The revelation was shocking, though Miss Marple found that it explained several things that had puzzled her about the reclusive colonel. How dreadful. But surely Margaret Rivers reported this to her superiors. She did, but before they could act on her information, she was killed. Her death was made to look like an accident, but these documents make it clear that she was murdered to prevent her from testifying against the collaboration network. Inspector Slack turned several pages in the folder, revealing a detailed map of St. Mary Mead with various locations marked in red ink. But Colonel Weston wasn't working alone. Margaret had identified at least 3 other people in the village who were part of the network. One of them was feeding information about local defense preparations to the Germans. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach as she waited for the inspector to continue. The other collaborator Margaret identified was a young woman who worked as a volunteer with the Women's Voluntary Service, someone who had access to information about evacuee placements, supply depot locations, and local defense preparations. Slack's voice grew heavy with the weight of his revelations. Someone named Dorothy Bantry. The name hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Miss Marple found herself thinking about Dolly Bantry, as she had known her for so many years. Cheerful, helpful, always eager to organize village events and charitable activities. The idea that such a woman could have been responsible for betraying her own country seemed almost impossible to accept. "You're quite certain of this?" Miss Marple asked quietly. The documentation is extensive. Margaret Rivers was a thorough investigator, and she had copies of messages that Dolly Bantry passed to German contacts, along with evidence of payments she received for the information. Inspector Slack's expression was grim. According to the files, Mrs. Bantry believed she was helping Jewish refugees escape from Germany. She was told that the information she provided would be used to establish safe houses and escape routes. Miss Marple nodded slowly. This explained much about Dolly Bantry's behaviour over the years. Her almost compulsive need to help with charitable causes, as if she were trying to atone for some past sin. So she was used by the Germans without fully understanding what she was doing. That appears to be the case, but the results were the same. British soldiers died because of the information she provided, including Margaret Rivers's brother Robert, who was Sarah Clement's fiancé. The tragic irony of the situation was not lost on Miss Marple. Sarah Clement, who had lost her beloved fiancé because of Dolly Bantry's unwitting collaboration, had been staying as a guest in the very house of the woman responsible for Robert's death. "There's more," Inspector Slack continued, turning to the final section of the folder. Margaret Rivers suspected that when the war ended, someone would try to eliminate all evidence of the collaboration network. She was particularly concerned about what would happen to Colonel Weston and the other collaborators if their activities were discovered. He showed Miss Marple a handwritten note in Margaret's careful script. "If anything happens to me, the truth about the network must be preserved. DB may not have understood what she was doing, but she must be held accountable for the consequences. The families of the dead deserve to know the truth." Miss Marple studied the document thoughtfully. So Margaret hid this evidence, hoping that someday justice would be served? "It appears so, but here's what I find most troubling, Miss Marple. According to the dates on these documents, Vivienne Ashford had been in contact with Margaret Rivers shortly before Margaret's death. There are references to meetings between them, and suggestions that Vivienne knew about Margaret's intelligence work. The implications were becoming clearer. So when Vivienne threatened to reveal the truth about Margaret's death, she was also threatening to expose the collaboration network. Exactly. And that gave Mrs. Bantry a very powerful motive for murder, not just to protect herself from prosecution for wartime collaboration, but to prevent the exposure of activities that had resulted in her neighbours' deaths. As Inspector Slack prepared to leave, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the tragic chain of events that had led from wartime betrayal to present-day murder. Dolly Bantry had spent 20 years living with the guilt of her unwitting collaboration, and when faced with the prospect of exposure, she had chosen to commit an even more terrible crime. Standing at her window and watching the inspector's car disappear into the night, Miss Marple reflected that the most devastating secrets were often those born of good intentions gone terribly wrong. Dolly Bantry had believed she was helping refugees, but her misplaced trust had led to the deaths of people she would never know, and ultimately to the murder of someone who had simply sought to reveal the truth. The lace gloves with their hidden coordinates had served their purpose at last, delivering Margaret Rivers' final message across 20 years of silence. But Miss Marple suspected that the revelations were far from over, and that the morning would bring new tragedies to light in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 8. Sarah Clement Pays the Price. Miss Marple was awakened before dawn by a frantic pounding at her cottage door. She made her way downstairs with the careful haste of someone who understood that urgent summons in the small hours rarely brought good news. Opening the door, she found Colonel Bantry standing on her doorstep, his face haggard and his usually immaculate appearance dishevelled in a way that spoke of genuine crisis. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you must come at once. It's Sarah. We found her unconscious in her room. Dr. Haydock is with her now, but—" His voice trailed off, unable to complete the terrible thought. Miss Marple required no further explanation. She gathered her coat and followed Colonel Bantry through the pre-dawn darkness to Gossington Hall, her mind already working through the implications of this development. If Sarah Clement had been harmed, it suggested that the secrets revealed by Margaret Rivers' hidden documents were claiming another victim. The scene at Gossington Hall was one of controlled chaos. Dr. Haydock's car stood in the driveway, and lights blazed from every window of the house. Inside, Miss Marple found the doctor emerging from the guest room where Sarah had been staying, his face grave with professional concern. "How is she, doctor?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Alive, but barely," Dr. Haydock replied, keeping his voice low. "Massive overdose of barbiturates. If Colonel Bantry hadn't found her when he did." He shook his head grimly. "As it is, it will be touch and go for the next few hours." Miss Marple's gaze moved to the closed door of Sarah's room. Was there any indication of what drove her to such desperation? Dr. Haydock reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She left this on her bedside table. A confession of sorts. Miss Marple accepted the note with steady hands, though her heart was already heavy with anticipation of what she might find. Sarah's handwriting was shaky but legible, the words clearly composed under extreme emotional distress. "I cannot bear the weight of what I have learned. Vivienne Ashford had to die because of the secrets she threatened to reveal. Secrets about Robert's death and the people responsible for it. I killed her with the poisoned gloves just as she killed my beloved with her investigations 20 years ago. I pray God will forgive me for what I have done, as I cannot forgive myself. The truth about the war must remain buried with those who died for it." Miss Marple read the confession twice, her sharp mind noting several things that troubled her about its contents. When she looked up, she found both Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry watching her with expressions of profound sadness. "Poor girl," Colonel Bantry murmured. "The strain of staying in this house, so close to where it all happened, must have been unbearable once she learned the truth." But Miss Marple was studying the confession more carefully, her experienced eye detecting discrepancies that others might miss. "Dr. Haydock," she said carefully, "when you examined the scene, did you notice anything unusual about the arrangement of the room?" The doctor looked puzzled. "Unusual? Not particularly. The sleeping pills were on the bedside table, the water glass nearby. Everything one might expect in such circumstances. And the note itself, where exactly was it positioned?" "Folded neatly beside the pill bottle, placed so it would be immediately visible to anyone entering the room." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her experience, genuine suicide notes were rarely placed with such consideration for their discovery. They were more often found clutched in the victim's hand or left in some deeply personal location. The careful positioning of Sarah's confession suggested someone who wanted to ensure it would be found quickly and without question. "Has Mrs. Bantry been informed?" Miss Marple asked. Colonel Bantry's expression grew even more troubled. "That's the peculiar thing. When I went to wake Dolly to tell her what had happened, I found her room empty. Her bed hadn't been slept in, and some of her clothes are missing. I've searched the house and grounds, but there's no sign of her. This development confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the events of the night. If Dolly Bantry had fled, it suggested either overwhelming guilt or a desperate attempt to escape justice. But it also raised questions about the timing of Sarah's apparent suicide attempt. "Colonel," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if I might examine Sarah's room. There may be details that could help us understand what happened." In the guest room, Miss Marple observed the scene with the methodical attention she had developed over many years of unravelling mysteries. The room was tidy, almost too tidy for someone who had been contemplating suicide. The water glass on the bedside table was positioned precisely, and the pill bottle was empty but clean, showing no fingerprints or residue that one might expect from desperate shaking hands. More telling still was what Miss Marple found when she examined the note more closely. While the handwriting was indeed Sarah's, there were subtle differences in the letter formation that suggested it had been written under duress. Several words showed signs of hesitation, as if the writer had been pausing to receive dictation. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe Sarah may have been forced to write this confession, and given Mrs. Bantry's disappearance, I fear we may be looking at attempted murder rather than suicide." The doctor's face paled as he considered the implications. "You think Dolly tried to kill Sarah to prevent her from revealing the truth about the wartime collaboration?" "I think Mrs. Bantry realised that the discovery of Margaret Rivers' documents would inevitably lead to exposure of her role in the collaboration network. With Sarah staying in her house and growing increasingly suspicious about her fiancé's death, Mrs. Bantry may have felt she had no choice but to silence her permanently." As they spoke, the sound of approaching sirens announced the arrival of Inspector Slack and the police medical team. Miss Marple made her way downstairs to meet them, her mind already working through the tragic sequence of events that had led to this moment. The pattern was becoming clear. Dolly Bantry had killed Vivienne Ashford to prevent the exposure of wartime secrets, but Sarah Clement had been getting too close to the truth. Rather than risk another investigation, Mrs. Bantry had attempted to stage Sarah's suicide while making it appear that the young woman was confessing to Vivienne's murder. Standing in the pre-dawn darkness outside Gossington Hall, Miss Marple reflected that desperation often drove people to commit increasingly desperate acts. Dolly Bantry's original collaboration with the Germans had been born of misguided compassion, but each subsequent crime had taken her further from any possibility of redemption. The question now was whether Sarah Clement would survive to tell the truth about what had really happened in her room that night, or whether Mrs. Bantry's final desperate gamble would succeed in burying the secrets of St. Mary Mead forever. Chapter 9. The Truth Hidden in Plain Sight at the Auction. By noon, Sarah Clement had regained consciousness, and with her awakening came the final pieces of the puzzle that Miss Marple had been patiently assembling. Inspector Slack had arranged for the key figures in the case to gather once more in the drawing room at Gossington Hall, the same room where Vivienne Ashford had met her death just days before. Present were Colonel Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Timothy Morse, released from custody that morning, and Sarah herself, pale but determined, supported by pillows in a comfortable chair. Inspector Slack stood near the window, his expression grave, while Miss Marple occupied her preferred position where she could observe everyone's reactions. "Before we begin," Miss Marple said gently, addressing Sarah, "are you quite certain you feel well enough for this? The events of last night were terribly traumatic." Sarah's voice was hoarse but steady. "I need to tell the truth, Miss Marple. I've been silent too long, and it nearly cost me my life." She glanced around the room with eyes that held a new resolve. "Mrs. Bantry forced me to write that confession at gunpoint. She wanted everyone to believe I had killed Vivienne Ashford out of grief for Robert." Inspector Slack stepped forward. "Miss Clement has given us a full statement about what happened last night. But Miss Marple, you suggested this morning that you had worked out how the entire sequence of events unfolded. Would you be willing to share your conclusions?" Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably in her chair, her keen eyes moving from face to face as she began to weave together the threads of the mystery. "The key to understanding this case," she began, "lies in recognizing that we were witnessing not one crime, but the final act in a tragedy that began 20 years ago during the war. Dolly Bantry's collaboration with the Germans, however unwitting it may have been, set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately claim 3 lives." She paused, allowing this to settle before continuing. "Margaret Rivers, working for British intelligence, discovered the collaboration network that included both Colonel Weston and Mrs. Bantry. When Margaret was murdered to prevent her testimony, she had already taken precautions to preserve the evidence. The lace gloves with their hidden coordinates were her final message, a way of ensuring that someday the truth would emerge. Timothy Morse leaned forward slightly. But why did Vivienne Ashford have to die? What threat did she pose after all these years? An excellent question, Mr. Morse. You see, Vivienne had recently acquired something that Mrs. Bantry could not afford to have revealed. Margaret Rivers' personal diary from the war years. According to Sarah's statement, Vivienne had been contacted by a collector of theatrical memorabilia who had found the diary among Margaret's effects. Miss Marple's gaze rested on Sarah with gentle sympathy. The diary contained not only details of the intelligence operation, but also Margaret's growing suspicions about the people in St. Mary Mead who were betraying Allied secrets. Most damaging of all, it included Margaret's documentation of how the information provided by Mrs. Bantry had led directly to the ambush that killed Robert Clement. A sharp intake of breath from Colonel Bantry indicated his shock at this revelation about his wife's role in his guest's fiancé's death. Vivienne was not a blackmailer, Miss Marple continued. She was genuinely seeking to clear Margaret's name and expose the truth about her murder. But Mrs. Bantry could not allow that truth to emerge. The revelation of her wartime activities would not only destroy her reputation in the community she had served for decades, but would also expose her responsibility for the deaths of young men like Robert. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. But how did Mrs. Bantry know that Vivienne would handle the poisoned gloves? Surely she couldn't have predicted such a specific action. Miss Marple smiled slightly. That was perhaps the most clever aspect of her plan. Mrs. Bantry had prepared the gloves well in advance, knowing that eventually she might need to eliminate someone who threatened to expose her secrets. During the auction, she simply had to wait for the right moment. She gestured toward the table where the auction items had been displayed. You see, Mrs. Bantry was helping to arrange the lots throughout the evening. It would have been the simplest thing for her to slip the gloves among the accessories when Vivienne was examining them. As the evening's honoured guest and a professional actress accustomed to handling theatrical props, Vivienne would naturally pick up and examine anything that caught her interest. Inspector Slack nodded grimly, and the poison was designed to work quickly enough that Mrs. Bantry could retrieve the gloves and dispose of them before anyone realised they were the murder weapon. Precisely, but Mrs. Bantry hadn't counted on Vivienne's final act, clutching the gloves as she died. This left physical evidence that Mrs. Bantry couldn't eliminate, and it also preserved the coded message that Margaret Rivers had so carefully worked into the lace. Sarah spoke up, her voice stronger now. When I began to piece together the connection between my fiancé's death and Mrs. Bantry's wartime activities, she realised I was becoming dangerous. She tried to make it appear that I had killed Vivienne out of misplaced grief, then attempted suicide from guilt. Miss Marple's expression grew even more serious. What Mrs. Bantry failed to understand was that her original crime, the unwitting collaboration, could have been forgiven. Many people made mistakes during the war, often with tragic consequences. But murder to conceal those mistakes was unforgivable. Colonel Bantry, who had remained silent throughout most of the explanation, finally spoke. "Where is she now? My wife, I mean. Where has she gone?" Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "We found her car abandoned near Dover this morning. We believe she's attempting to flee to the continent, but all ports are being watched. It's only a matter of time." As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the case. Dolly Bantry had spent 20 years trying to atone for her wartime mistakes through charitable work and community service. But when faced with exposure, she had chosen to compound her original sin with crimes far worse than anything she had done during the war. The lace gloves, with their beautiful craftsmanship and hidden secrets, had finally delivered Margaret Rivers' message across 2 decades. Justice would be served at last, but at a cost that would forever change the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. Standing once more in the drawing room where it had all begun, Miss Marple thought about the patterns that connected past and present, and how the threads of human choice, both noble and ignoble, could weave tapestries of surprising complexity and unexpected consequence. Chapter 10. The Quiet After. 3 weeks had passed since the terrible events at Gossington Hall, and autumn had settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle melancholy that comes when the year begins its quiet slide toward winter. Miss Marple made her way along the familiar path to the village churchyard, carrying a small bouquet of late roses from her garden, white ones she had chosen for remembrance and new beginnings. The news had arrived that morning via Inspector Slack's telephone call. Dolly Bantry had been apprehended in Calais, attempting to board a ferry to Belgium. She would return to England to face trial for the murder of Vivienne Ashford and the attempted murder of Sarah Clement. The inspector had been characteristically brief in his report, but Miss Marple had detected a note of weary satisfaction in his voice. Justice, however delayed, would finally be served. As she approached the newer section of the churchyard, Miss Marple was pleased to see that she was not the only visitor that afternoon. Timothy Morse stood before a freshly installed headstone, his head bowed in quiet contemplation. Nearby, Sarah Clement sat on a small bench, her colour much improved from the pallor of her ordeal, though she still bore the careful movements of someone recovering from a serious trauma. The new memorial was simple but elegant, a modest stone bearing the inscription, Margaret Rivers, 1910-1943, actress, patriot, seeker of truth. The pattern of her life was beautiful and brave. Below this, in smaller text, also remembered, Robert Clement, 1918-1944. Miss Marple approached quietly, not wishing to intrude on what was clearly a private moment of remembrance. Timothy looked up as she drew near, his face bearing an expression of peace that had been absent during the dark days of his arrest and suspicion. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "how good of you to come. I wanted to thank you again for believing in my innocence when the evidence seemed so damning." "My dear boy," Miss Marple replied, placing a gentle hand on his arm, "the truth has a way of emerging, given time and patient observation. I'm simply glad that justice has been done, and that you and Sarah can begin to heal from these terrible events." Sarah rose from the bench, moving with care but showing a resilience that spoke well for her recovery. "The memorial is beautiful, isn't it? Timothy arranged for it to be made from the insurance settlement from Aunt Margaret's estate. We thought it was important that people know she was more than just another victim of wartime tragedy." Miss Marple studied the inscription with approval. "It's a fitting tribute, and I think Margaret would have been pleased to know that her final message, hidden in those lace gloves for 20 years, finally reached the people who needed to hear it." The three of them stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts about the complex web of tragedy and redemption that had brought them to this place. The afternoon sun filtered through the bare branches of the oak trees, casting gentle shadows across the memorial stones and creating patterns that shifted and changed with the movement of the wind. "Dr. Haydock tells me you'll be staying on as his assistant," Miss Marple said to Timothy, breaking the peaceful quiet. Timothy nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, he's been extraordinarily kind about the whole business. I think he understands that I need to build something positive here, in the place where Aunt Margaret's story finally came to light. There's healing to be done for the village, and for myself." "And you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, turning to Sarah. "Will you be staying in St. Mary Mead as well?" Sarah's response came with more certainty than Miss Marple had heard in her voice since the young woman's arrival. "For a while, yes. Colonel Bantry has asked me to help him sort through the estate papers and, well, to help him come to terms with what his wife did. He's a good man who deserves support through this difficult time." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. There was wisdom in Sarah's decision to transform her pain into service to others. The Colonel would indeed need help navigating the aftermath of his wife's crimes, and Sarah's own experience with loss and betrayal would serve her well in offering comfort to another wounded soul. As they prepared to leave the churchyard, Timothy paused to place a small object at the base of the memorial stone. Miss Marple saw that it was a piece of handmade lace, not the elaborate gloves that had carried Margaret's final message, but a simple bookmark with delicate edging that spoke of patience and care. "Mrs. Price made it," Timothy explained, noticing Miss Marple's interest. "She said every memorial should have something beautiful and personal, something that speaks to the human touch." Margaret would have appreciated the craftsmanship. Walking back through the village as the afternoon light began to fade, Miss Marple reflected on the curious way that evil often contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Dolly Bantry's attempts to hide her wartime collaboration had led her to commit crimes far worse than her original mistakes. But those same attempts had also ensured that the truth about Margaret Rivers's heroism would finally be revealed. The lace gloves, with their hidden coordinates and coded messages, had served as a bridge across 20 years of silence. They had carried Margaret's final intelligence report not to her wartime handlers, who were long dead or retired, but to the people who needed it most, her nephew seeking justice, her brother's fiancé seeking closure, and a village seeking to understand the complexities of its own history. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to look back toward the church spire rising above the trees. Tomorrow there would be other mysteries, other human puzzles requiring patient observation and gentle understanding. But tonight she was content to know that in this small corner of England, the truth had finally found its way to light. Inside her sitting room, settling into her favourite chair with her knitting and a cup of properly brewed tea, Miss Marple thought about patterns, not just the intricate lacework that had revealed so many secrets, but the larger patterns of human nature that repeated themselves across the generations. People made mistakes, carried guilt, sought redemption, and sometimes found it in the most unexpected ways. The case of the lace gloves was closed, but its lessons would remain. That secrets, however carefully buried, have a way of working their way to the surface. That the past never truly dies but lives on in the choices people make. And that justice, though sometimes delayed, can arrive with quiet certainty when patient souls refuse to let truth remain hidden in the shadows. It's so lovely to have you here with us tonight. There's something quite special about the way these mysteries bring together listeners from all corners of the world. If you want, share in the comments where you're joining us from. And don't forget to subscribe for a brand new mystery every day. Now, wrap yourself in a blanket or pour a cup of tea, and let's uncover the puzzle together.